Hi, my name's Andy Petrie. I'm a Director of Systems and Safety Assurance at Arch Artifacts here in Sydney. I gave this presentation to a conference last week and I've had lots of people contacting me asking if I could have a copy of the slides. As it's quite an interactive content, I thought it would be best if I did a recording for it, so here we go. Reasonably practicable. Two very simple words that form the basis of safety legislation here in Australia. Two terms that people get wrong on a very regular basis. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a legal professional, so I'm not going to give you any specific legal advice in this, but I am going to call out some advice given by Greg Smith, who is one of Australia's preeminent safety lawyers. He's got a great book called Proving Safety, and also some of this content comes from a presentation he gave to Engineers Australia a few months ago called What is Reasonably Practicable. The content in this slide comes from Greg. Greg defines the term reasonably practicable as a defined term in legislation. And he says that what this means is that the legal professionals, the lawyers, the solicitors, the barristers, whoever gets involved, now understand what this term means and they don't get distracted by arguing about it when they have meetings. It's a defined term and it's no longer up for debate. The two terms we're going to add to that today are so far as is reasonably practicable and as low as reasonably practicable. Now, these two terms add context to that legal definition, that term reasonably practicable, but they do not in any way change the meaning of the legal term and the legal test. This is really important as we go through the talk today. We're going to refer back to this quite a lot. Reasonably practicable is a defined legal term. SFAIRP and ALARP add context to the legal term. They do not change it. So a little bit about me. Before I moved to Australia, I spent many years working in the UK, working in a whole heap of industries: nuclear, oil and gas, chemicals, energy generation, water, and pretty much every aspect of the railways over in the UK. And during that time, I wrote lots of safety cases, I prepared lots of risk assessments, and I also reviewed safety cases and risk assessments prepared by others. And I think in almost every single case, I would say that those documents were summed up by using the term, the risk is ALARP. The risk is as low as reasonably practicable. And that's just what we did. Here's just some examples from my files. Two of these are risk assessments I did myself. One of these is a risk assessment done by a provider on a major project I worked on, and one is an operational safety case that was done by a registered rolling stock operator in the UK. When I got to Australia in 2013, I started working as a practitioner, and I'd occasionally get people say to me, we do SFAIRP in Australia, we don't do ALARP in Australia. This got me to thinking a little bit, and it never really sat right with me. But recently, a few years ago, when we were actually working in delivery, a couple of people would say to me, no, we don't do ALARP, we do SFAIRP, and wouldn't therefore we can't accept the work that you've done, because the risk assessment would say the risk is ALARP. Okay, I said, this is simple. We'll just go do a find and replace. We'll look for where it says ALARP and we'll replace it with the term SFAIRP because it's ultimately the same legal test. No, you can't do that. Why not? I asked. Well, you can't do that because SFAIRP and ALARP are different. And as just pointed out on a previous slide, I couldn't really understand what they were saying here. There's no real definition or reason why anyone would say SFAIRP and ALARP are different. But when you look into it and look in the internet and look at the advice people are giving, you find actually that there's a small section of the engineering community and the safety community here in Australia that have made a point of making ALARP and SFAIRP different. They've created definitions of what these things are, and they've been doing training courses, they've been writing books. You've probably even been to a presentation that's been provided by one of these people over the last 10 years where they make a point of saying SFAIRP and ALARP are different. Now, as we're going to look over the next few slides, there's no real reason for that. But again, just want to work through this process one slide at a time with everyone. So, where did it all begin? The term reasonably practicable really came into use in 1949 in the UK. There was a case called Edwards versus the National Coal Board, and what happened, the National Coal Board at the time were managing a number of mines, and these were underground mines with props, not open cast mines as we tend to associate now. One of these mines tunnels had collapsed, and in the course of collapsing, Mr. Edwards had been killed. The family brought a case against the National Coal Board, And it really judged on the case of whether the National Coal Board was responsible for maintaining pits and supports and props in disused mine shafts, or actually it would be unreasonable for them to do so. And in summing up the case, the judge said, and again, I've highlighted the terms here that I want you to read. Reasonably practicable is a narrower term than physically possible. It implies that a computation must be made in which the quantum of risk is placed on one side and the sacrifice is placed on the other. And in this legislation, the sacrifice is defined as time, trouble, or money. We now use the term time, cost, and effort as a bit of an easy way of saying this. You put those both on a scale and depends on whether there's a gross disproportion between the two. If there's not a disproportion, then you should do the task and expend the effort. If there's a disproportion, then you don't have to do that, and the risk becomes what we call acceptable. Another thing that we call out here is that the person upon whom the obligation is imposed discharges the onus which is on them. For most of what we do here, we're looking at designers or constructors, but also this plays a part in operations and maintenance later on. So while this was case law in 1949, it really became enshrined in the UK Health and Safety at Work Act, etc. in 1974 in the UK, and has been the basis of every piece of safety legislation in the UK since then. Victoria got a bit of a jump on the rest of Australia, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004 introduced the legal test of so far as is reasonably practicable. And the rest of Australia introduced that from 2011 with the Standardised Work Health Safety Act. You can see the wording there in the two pieces of legislation between Australia and the UK. While the UK refers to as employer rather than PCBU, and the UK refers to health, safety and welfare rather than just health and safety, you can see it's effectively, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same legal test to ensure so far as it's reasonably practicable. And then the various clauses of the specific terms come into practice. To be really clear here, there is no difference between the two pieces of legislation, and we'll come on to this later as a corrected issue. Why does the UK talk about risk? Well, the UK's legislation is really based on risk assessment. Undertake a risk assessment, focus on a risk assessment. And this comes out of a couple of pieces of legislation, not legislation, but work that was done by the regulator in the 80s. At the time, they were looking at expanding nuclear power stations in the UK and wanted to understand how risk was considered in this context, and when was it an acceptable level of risk from a power station, or when could we tolerate that level of risk. That was updated in the 2001 document, Reducing Risk, Protecting People, moving the focus away from nuclear power stations, but considering risk as a whole across the UK industry, covering high hazard industries like the nuclear power stations, chemical plants, etc., but also something that could be applied across the general workforce, looking at those quantified risk assessments on one hand, where we do detailed calculations, but also how we apply it using a qualitative approach and a matrix style approach that we use nowadays. So we've got the background, we know where it comes from, but what does this reasonably practicable thing really mean? It's quite an abstract construct, and it's very difficult to get your head around coming at it from an outside. So what I like to do, I like to talk about hiking, and what I'm going to do here is talk about an example of this mountain. This is in the Lake District. This is near where I was brought up. I used to go camping here quite a lot, where that little cottage is on the shore. What we want to do today is look at the concept of walking down the mountain and defining where the bottom of the mountain is. And this will make sense in a few slides, but assume we're at the top of Fleetwith Pike, and someone has asked us to walk to the bottom of the mountain. There's a few different places I'm going to call out to you here that we're going to look at on the next few slides. But on to the right of that mountain, you'll see a bit of a pass where you stop going down and you start going up another mountain. We're going to call that A. Is that the bottom of the mountain? You could walk down that path down the mountain, and where we get to the farm and the fields, we could call that the bottom of the mountain. That's where your car's probably parked. That's where the farmers started putting fences up and managing it as a farm rather than a mountainside. You could keep walking down through the field, down to the cottage, so you stood on the shore of the lake. We could define that as the bottom of the mountain if you wanted to. It's further down than the farm. It's lower in height. We could theoretically walk into the lake, and we'd probably need to put a change of clothes on, probably a wetsuit because that lake is very cold. Let me assure you of that. So just before we move on to the next slide, where in your head do you think we would define the bottom of the mountain? A, B, C, or D? It's your choice, but we start at the top. We're starting this journey at the top of the mountain. Somebody's asked you to walk to the bottom. If you look at that now again, we've got those 4 positions plotted on this graph. When I do this, most people do come up with B being the bottom of the mountain. You probably did as well. That's where we'd say a reasonable person would define the bottom of the mountain. Let's go through them each at a time. We've got A. We've got that option which is lower than the top, and theoretically you start going up again. But we could quite easily see that wasn't the bottom of the mountain because we could have kept walking down the valley. We do have D. We could theoretically go into the lake and say it's the bottom of the mountain, but this is the term here. That's physically possible. As I say, we'd have to put on a wetsuit, a diving bell, some other forms of way of breathing underwater. So while it's physically possible, it's not practicable to do that. That's where the term practicable comes into this definition. We could then say we could walk to the edge of the lake and stand on the shore at the edge of the lake. And while it's possibly a few meters lower down than position B that we've all probably agreed is the bottom of the mountain, it's not reasonable to walk that extra kilometer just to get a few meters down and say, hey, we're slightly lower. The bottom of the mountain is probably where you all agreed is where the farm is. It's where the mountainside becomes a field and where that car is parked. If we take that concept, then this is how I like to transfer this to the concept of reasonably practicable. We talked at this earlier about the case law from Edwards versus the National Coal Board, that quantum of risk on one side and the effort, time, trouble, and money on the other side, and we have a balance. And what reasonably practicable is the point where the slope changes, that the inflection point between the gradient of actually making things more safe for a small amount of effort to actually we're expending a huge amount of effort for things that aren't necessarily making a great deal of improvement. And it's that inflection point which is the reasonably practicable test. It's like climbing down the mountain. You can see where the bottom is, or actually you can probably feel it in your knees as you start getting a bit older. It stops going down and it becomes flat. And that's really the same test that we apply to describing where the reasonably practicable point is. You may actually have, when you stood at the top of the mountain, a few options to get to a reasonably practical point. We saw one example there where there was the farm on one side of the mountain, but actually if you went the other way, over the back, you could have gone down to a different point. It might have been slightly higher, might have been slightly lower, might have been a slightly further walk. But both of those points could be defined as reasonably practicable when you're at the top of the mountain. The example I give here is if we're looking at installing a new advanced signalling system on a new railway being built in Australia, there's a couple of really established technologies we'd use, one being CBTC, communication-based train control, or one ETCS, the European Train Control System. These are different. They both have different costs. They both have different impacts. They both have different benefits. They both have slightly different levels of safety depending on what you're doing. If you were to say, let's put a signalling system in and you chose CBTC, you'd be doing the same as Metro Tunnel Project has in Melbourne. You'd be doing the same as what they're doing in Perth. If you decided, let's do ETCS, you'd do what Digital Systems in Sydney has and Crossriver Rail up in Brisbane. Both of these are reasonably practicable options. There could be loads of other options here. You could be, hey, just let's extend the traditional signalling system. That's not really going to cut it nowadays. The new technology is available. Or we could define this bespoke technology where we could spend years doing investigations, trying to eke tiny little bits of safety improvements out of that. You would probably say that's not reasonably practicable because we have two suitable technologies, CBTC and ETCS. So you're going to pick one of those two. You're going to go ahead with it, and that's going to be your approach. So now this is where we get to the terms of describing the context of the bottom of the mountain. There's two ways I could describe that journey to the bottom of the mountain. We could say we've walked down the mountain so far as is reasonably practicable. That doesn't have to be walking. It could be skied, it could be ran, it could be hopped, it could be any verb that describes the action of descending down the mountain. It's an activity. It's a verb that describes it. Because the height of the mountain is a measurable quantity, we could also describe it as the height at the bottom of the mountain as well. So the height down the mountain is as low as reasonably practicable in this measurable quantity, which in this case is meters. So we've got two ways of describing the bottom of the mountain, and that also applies to our test of reasonably practicable. We start at the top. and we can describe the activity. In this case, it could be managed, it could be ensured, it could be reduced. There's a whole heap of verbs that we apply to that test of so far as is reasonably practicable. We've managed safety so far as reasonably practicable is the activity of managing safety. We could describe the risk. The risk is as low as reasonably practicable. This is the outcome. So this is the context on the legal test. One is an activity, one is an outcome in a measurable way. This is when we go back to that test at the start that they both describe the same legal test. I can't understand why people confuse these two things. There are examples later on where I can show you why people could have come to a different conclusion. But I want you just to remember this now. This is why they're the same thing. They describe the same legal test. One is an activity, one is an outcome. So if ALARP describes a risk, why don't we just use that all the time? That's a good question. But reasonably practicable when you consider the legal context is more than just risk management. I'll call out one of Greg Smith's slides here as well, a presentation he gave to Engineers Australia a few months ago. Describes reasonably practicable from an organisational context, from the PCBU in Australia. You must have improper processes for managing risk, whether that be eliminating, reducing, etc. You must have a process for ensuring that the people are competent or adequately supervised when they're applying your processes. And you must have processes for checking, doing due diligence checks or audits that those people are taking reasonable care when they're applying those processes. So those two things also form part of the reasonably practicable test at the organizational level, the PCBU, as opposed to the people like you and me who apply those processes on a daily basis to manage the risk, the specific risks. So we can't just use ALARP if we're looking at the whole legal context and PCBU, but we can use ALARP perfectly fine if we're just talking about the management of risk. One of the benefits we have in most regulated industries such as rail, we don't really have too much nuclear in Australia, but high hazard industries and aviation is that we have to have those processes in anyway. So we don't need as a person applying those processes to focus too much on them because they're in place. That's an organizational duty. But we look at the application of those. And if you're talking about risk, it is perfectly fine to say the risk is ALARP. That's it. There's no discussion here. It's a perfectly fine way of saying it. If you want to say you've managed safety so far, that's fine. If you want to say the risk is ALARP, that's fine. So why have people got to this conclusion that they're two different things? Why are we in a situation where there's people in Australia writing books and putting up websites saying, actually, these things are two completely different things and they should never be mixed up? When I talked about that document, the tolerability of risk from nuclear power stations and the reducing risk protecting people document, one of the key things there is it comes up with a concept called the tolerability of risk framework. This is this carrot we see here. And in this framework, particularly when you're looking at high hazard installations such as nuclear or chemical or oil and gas, where you can actually understand risk as a number, as a quantum, where you can do calculations, then you can actually calculate the individual risk to people, be they commuters or be they people working on the plant or people living nearby to that facility. If you go through the process of doing a quantified assessment and a calculation, and you actually identify what those risks are, and you can assess them in terms of a specific number, and in this case, it would be the risk of a fatality per year, then you can apply the tolerability risk framework. Now, at the very, very top, we have what we call intolerable. There's a level there under which the regulator in the UK will say, no way, Jose, we're not accepting any risk over this level. Just go away and think about it, do something else and come back when you've got a different approach. They're called intolerable risks. You could probably argue there's a couple of industries that borderline that. They're usually things like forestry, deep sea fishing, but it's generally not tolerated for most industries. There's a bit at the bottom where they call it broadly acceptable. It's this line where we call one in a million chance of dying in a year. Now that's the risk you face every day. That's the risk you're probably facing now since you left your house this morning, and actually this 1 in a million is probably safer than the journey you've had to work, sitting in the office, going home, making your dinner, going to bed. So that's when the regulator said, actually, this is just background risk. And if we can demonstrate we're a background risk, we can accept that because we just do in our daily life and get on with it. And that's that 1 in a million. If you're in between these two limits, then what they call is this, we tolerate this risk if and only if we can demonstrate that the risk has been managed as low as reasonably practicable. So if you're in that area, and that's where we do safety cases and risk assessments for the most part, is to say, actually, we've assessed the risk. It's in this area where it's tolerable because we've put these controls in place. And that's the basis of the tolerability of risk process. It's worth just pointing out here as well that that lower limit of broadly acceptable, the 1 in a million, it's actually a very, very low level of risk. As I've said, it's safer than what you do on every day. 10 to the minus 6. When we do risk assessments, for example, and we do something like 10 to the minus 9. Sorry, let's just go back a bit. That 10 to the minus 6 as a concept, if you think about the mountain I showed you earlier, if you're at 10 to the minus 6, you're probably standing on the shore at the edge of the lake. You've gone past the farm, you've gone down the field, you're probably already standing at the shore at the edge of the lake. That's why it's safe to make that determination that actually we're really comfortable that we'll be well beyond what would be our reasonable practicable test in this area. If you look at other numbers that you can calculate using this, like 10 to the minus 9, you're probably now looking at a 1 in a billion year event. And what you're doing now is you're arguing about the next pebble on that beach that you're standing. You can go 10 to the minus 12, which is 1 in a trillion. You're now arguing about the grain of sand beside the pedal, and should we implement that grain of sand? And I've seen recently 10 to the minus 16s and 10 to the minus 18s where we're looking at specks of dust on the sand now. So when we get to those really low numbers, which I want you to go back to that image of the mountain and imagine having an argument about dust on the grain of sand as opposed to recognizing that you've come down Fleetwood Pike. You may have come down Mount Everest, depending on what your scale is. But just have the context that you don't need to spend too much time worrying about these numbers, provided that you've done a consistent and repeatable approach to get there. Now, what's the problem here is that some people, over the use of this, have mislabeled this approach. They've firstly taken the quantified numbers off there. This happens a lot. So you'll just see generally they've translated it to a risk matrix, and hey, if you're in the green bit, you're acceptable. If you're in the red bit, you're unacceptable. And if you're in the middle, you're ALARP. This is completely incorrect and a misuse of this principle. However, people have taken this as truth. If you look at the middle region there, the one on the left, it says tolerable if ALARP, and that word if is really, really important. You have to demonstrate that you have managed your risk ALARP. On the right, that if has gone away, and what happens is people will apply this risk matrix because their company has put into a process that's misinterpreted it, and they will say, hey, I'm in the yellow bit, I'm ALARP, it's fine, cool, let's go. And what they've not done is actually demonstrate that SFAIRP. They've basically said we've got a medium risk and it's fine to accept a medium risk. So a lot of the issues that I see, I think, come from a misunderstanding in the industry that this triangle is the ALARP triangle. It is not the ALARP triangle. It is a tolerability of risk triangle when it is applied with a quantified calculation only. So if you ever see this triangle in use, if you ever see a risk metric saying SFAIRP or ALARP in the middle, it's wrong. You need to say, this is incorrect, let's move on. Let's actually find a way of assessing our risks differently. And that's not difficult. You know, it's what we do every day. But one of the biggest problems that people do is they see this thing on the right and think this is the ALARP, and it is not. It is absolutely not. It's a misuse of the tolerability of risk framework. I think back when the new legislation came out, and we're talking about the Work Health Safety Act here in 2011, there's a bit of a gap in Australia. They've gone from very prescriptive, you must safety legislation to this SFAIRP concept. And because there's a lack of guidance or sometimes contradictory guidance from other industry bodies, people took it upon themselves to fill in the gap. Now, what we have here on the left is some words from the Engineers Australia Safety Case Guideline from 2014. And just firstly to point out, we are working on updating this right now. So we've recognised that this is wrong and it needs updated. But pretty much every line on there that's underlined is incorrect. You know, there is no requirement in the Work Health and Safety legislation for a due diligence defence into law. The Work Health Safety Act provides due diligence obligations on officers of organisations. An officer of your organisation is your chief executive or of a senior party who has significant sway over the whole organisation. And those definitions are in the Corporations Act as well. This isn't just me making things up as well. A completeness argument as to why all critical safety issues have been identified. And again, the test is reasonably foreseeable safety issues, reasonably foreseeable hazards, not all credible. You do not have to go looking for things that are never going to happen and justify why they're never going to happen. All practicable precautions have been identified. Again, the test is reasonably practicable, as we've said. You don't have to go into the lake and identify why all of those precautions in the lake or at the edge of the lake need to be then justified as why you don't do them. The term is reasonably practicable. You don't then do it the other way around. And again, you don't, this comment here, you start with what you can do and justify why you don't do things, again, is incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is up for, has been up for debate for a while in certain circumstances and certain people, but it's really clear that this is wrong. And if you look on the right, this is some case law from the Supreme Court of Victoria in 2019. In this case, a magistrate had prosecuted based on an interpretation on the left, and the Supreme Court had said, actually, the magistrate, no, you're incorrect. Your interpretation is wrong. Here's a few things highlighted here, and it says we have to consider the risks and the ways of eliminating risks that employer ought to have known. Not things that they should have investigated, done studies to find, what they ought to have known, what a reasonable person that role ought to have known. And actually what ways, and when it comes to ways of reducing their risk, it's not what it could have done. It's what they ought to have done. This is clarified then in a way, again, it's a simple way of putting it. Reasonably practicable is what the employer, the piece of you should have done, not what it could have done. So again, go back to the mountain. Reasonably practicable is the bottom of the mountain. It's not having to go into the lake and work your way back again, and the employer doesn't have to justify why they're not in the lake. They're where they're at. Now, this term, what you should have done, again, we're not going to get into it too much here, but there's pretty obvious things you can do here, like we comply with a contemporary and current standard that manages that risk. A great example, if you're building a building, an office, you comply with the Building Code of Australia, the National Construction Code, whichever you're calling it. If that says have 2 fire escapes the size of your building, you put in 2 fire escapes, that's it. That's what you should do. There's no reason why you need to then go and justify why you didn't put 5 fire escapes in or 6 fire escapes. You could have, but you shouldn't. You don't need to do that. You should comply with the standard. And that's just one example of this. And again, we can go any comments or questions, drop me a line and we can have a discussion about those. So again, these are the 2 sources of confusion that I've come across the most. There are others, but these are the 2 that I find the most. So remember these 2. SFAIRP is what you should do, ALARP, whichever one you call it, not what you could have done. You don't have to go to the end of the world and justify why you don't do things. You need to get to that position and be satisfied that was what you should do. And the misuse of the tolerability of risk approach is not ALARP. ALARP is just a way of describing reasonably practical in terms of measurable quantity, which is the risk. So again, wrapping up now, there's no debate on this. As Greg said in that slide at the front, reasonably practicable is a defined legal term. There is no debate. If you don't understand the context differences, then you know we've tried to explain it really clearly in simple terms here. If somebody's trying to create a debate, there's obviously a reason they do that. They might simply just not understand, and when you have a role in explaining them, or if they keep going on, then I can only assume they've got vested interest in trying to do this, like they want to keep selling their books. You know, the earth isn't round, it isn't flat. It doesn't matter how much you believe that, it's just not. The moon isn't made of cheese. ALARP and SFAIRP are not different. Just remember those things when we go forward. So just to go over a few of those things that we've covered earlier, and again, some terms that I correct regularly when I'm having discussions with people. The UK legislation is not different from the Australian legislation. The UK legislation does not say you must do ALARP. We've covered that on one of the earlier slides. Because this slightly different misuses have been going on in Australia for a while, I've had people say to me, well, you have to recognize that we've been using it this way for a while, therefore we've created a new definition. But you don't create new legal definitions because you get things wrong. The legal definition is a legal definition. You have to respect that. If you've been using it incorrectly, acknowledge that you've been using it incorrectly and correct it is the simple way forward. I occasionally get asked by someone, I need to make things more SFAIRP or demonstrate things should be more SFAIRP. Again, as we've said, once you get to the bottom of the mountain, you're at the bottom of the mountain. Once you've got your reasonably practicable, you've got a reasonably practicable. There is no requirement under anywhere in the legislation to keep demonstrating why you have to be more safe. Another one we come across is that people say, well, what if the definitions change in the future? What if a judge comes up with something new at a point in the future? Well, if that happens, we draw a line in the sand, we change our guidance and we go forward. Again, the analogy I like to give here is I don't drive at 80 kilometers an hour on the freeway on the off chance that the speed might change at some point in the future. drive at the speed limit. If the speed limit changes in the future, I'll drive at a slightly lower speed. Don't start assuming that things might change in the future, and you have to prepare yourself now. As we said, the legislation does not put due diligence obligations on engineers. The Work Health Safety Act puts due diligence obligations on officers of an organization. You are probably not an officer in an organization if you're watching this. You should speak to the officers of your organization, make sure they understand their duties, and that's, again, proper processes in place, competent and or supervised people, and checks and balances that people are being applied. As an individual in an organization, you have to take reasonable care applying those processes, and that's the individual duty. There's no other obligations here for you to go out and find things. And if you do a quantified risk assessment, and you've done a repeatable process, if you've actually come to an outcome that shows the risk to an individual is below 1 in a million, you can say it's broadly acceptable and move on. Provided that you have followed your company's processes and you're competent to do it, you've met the test of reasonably practicable. That's okay. For people to say you can't do that, again, they're just incorrect. I would just counter this and check with your regulator specifically if you think you've had any doubt. If somebody says we don't do that in X industry, check with X industry, because that probably means your regulator has a different view rather than the legal community that you'll be dealing with. So that's just the only caveat I would say on that. Check with your regulator. Just some takeaways then. Just to wrap up and before we finish, the legal test is reasonably practicable. If you are referring to an activity, implication of your legal duty or otherwise to manage, reduce, eliminate, whatever, then use SFAIRP, because SFAIRP relates to the activity. If you're referring to the quantum of risk, refer to the term ALARP, because you're talking about the risk, and the risk is as low. ALARP is not the tolerability of risk approach, and it is definitely not the misuse of the tolerability of risk approach. Reasonably practicable is what you should do, not what you could do. And reasonably practicable is based on case law, not people's beliefs. Mentioned Greg's presentations, but I highly recommend you buy his book, Proving Safety. This goes into this in a whole heap more detail. So when you're doing your reasonably practicable, remember you start your journey at the top of the mountain. You don't get to the bottom and then say, hey, we have to reduce our risk from here. Find out, be clear what it is. If you've got options at the top, work out what the options are, select the one that you want to do and implement it. You don't have to then get to the bottom and then keep justifying why you haven't done more things. And as a final note, if anyone's trying to make this complicated, they probably don't understand the process. There will be, on very rare occasions, with some highly advanced new level technology where you have to do a little bit more, but 99% of what you do won't require that. I'll post this link on LinkedIn, and again, you'll find the chats on my page there. I'll keep an eye on the comments at the bottom of here, but if you could keep discussions on LinkedIn, drop me a line if you have any questions. And yeah, please keep up the good fight, and let's put this to bed once and for all.